Segos, Kanagoga, Alisawa Yungits. My background is Kanyakahaga, or Mohawk, and Mi'kmaq, from the northeastern part of what is now the United States and southeastern Canada. And today what I'm going to talk about is bringing together a couple of different projects that I have been working on from my previous book and then the one that I am here, and my office is right over there, here at the Humanities Center. So tonight I'm going to talk about environmental reproductive justice and seed rematriation, what seed savers and midwives can teach us about ecocultural health. What I'm going to talk about is a breast milk study that happened in the Mohawk community of Akwesasne, which is downstream from one federal and two state Superfund sites on the borders of what's now the US and Canada, New York, Ontario, and Quebec. And in 1983, it was determined that PCBs had leached from the General Motors plant into the river, into the groundwater. They contaminated the fish. And it was Mohawk midwife Gudgie Cook whose initial concern was, is the breast milk safe? Should she be advising the women that she was delivering their babies at home to be breastfeeding their babies? And so she went down to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and said, look, we've been fighting with the state for a couple hundred years. We don't get along so well, but I need you to come up here and do this for me. Come up and test the fish, which they did and found out that, yes, the PCBs had gotten into the fish. PCBs are lipophilic. They attach to fat. So then her concern was, are they getting into the breast milk, which, as you can see from this series of newspaper clippings, they were. And so she decided to start the first environment research project, which revolutionized how environmental health research is now done in Indigenous communities. And so she went to the Department of Health and to the New York State, the State University of New York at Albany, and said, we're going to design this research project, but you're not going to send white guys in lab coats in to collect breast milk because the women are not going to hand over their breast milk. You're going to teach other women how to collect these samples. And so for the first time, instead of guys in lab coats, graduate students and professors and scientists, it was women collecting these samples from other women. And as part of learning about their body burden, and she called it the first environment research project with the acknowledgement that the first environment that we are all exposed to is within the womb. And so if you're already born exposed to contaminants, how does that impact your trajectory down the road? And what they found, and what the community learned, was basically that as the river had been contaminated, so had people's bodies. So when Gudgie had her own breast milk tested and got those components back and she read them aloud, she said, look, I have the same ingredients as the dump inside my body. And so it's a broader narrative about how do we determine the edge of contaminated sites when the EPA says, well, the edge of the site is where the contamination stops. And so if the contamination is in your breast milk and in your children, what does that then mean for the edge of and the boundary determining of this site? And in order to avoid being exposed to contaminants, people were told, well, just stop eating fish. If you don't eat the fish, you don't get the PCBs in your body. And so here's for a community that had been living off of fishing and farming and gardening since time immemorial, was told, well, that's the cheapest way to avoid being exposed as opposed to forcing a very expensive cleanup. So environmental justice, you probably have read all of these. The official definition, according to the EPA, is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development and implementation and enforcement of environmental laws, policies, and regulations. So basically it's saying everyone should just be exposed equally to the same contaminants, right? As opposed to, hey, why do we not contaminate the environment? So this is how people have defined it and worked toward environmental justice. And there's a lot of talk about how, within Indigenous communities, maybe that looks different. So environmental justice might not be, can we clean it up the same as your local suburb if suburbanites don't care if there's a landfill under the yard because they're not trying to eat out of the local environment. Indigenous communities have different relationships with that environment. And people in Akwesasne were arguing for a different definition of community. So when you think of community as the humans that you are related to and that you get along best with, people were saying, well, what about the fish communities and the bird communities and the muskrat communities? Right now, the studies are being done in such a way as how to prevent human exposure without thinking about those other communities. Reproductive justice, and this is Sister Song, a women of color organization that developed this concept, is the right to have children, to not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and healthy environments. It's based on the human right to make decisions about one's life and the obligation of government and society to ensure that conditions are suitable for implementing one's decisions. And this is a picture of Gudji with her grandson. And so part of what Gudji's work has been built around is environmental reproductive justice. So basically, how do you bring those two concepts together? How do you make it so that a community's reproductive capabilities are not inhibited by environmental contamination? And if you can't have as many kids as you wanted to because you're suffering from the health impacts of being exposed to environmental contamination, then that is a reproductive justice issue. But at the same time, reframing how do we think about reproduction to not just be about having babies, but also, who's going to get to me first with the charger? But also thinking about reproduction in the context of reproducing culturally informed tribal citizens. So again, if you have to raise your kids as though they're suburban white kids because they can't touch the environment and they can't eat off the land, you are not necessarily reproducing your community in the same way. So that's environmental reproductive justice. And so right now, and I was frantically texting earlier, we're planning this year. So there's clan mothers in the community that revived and created a rites of passage ceremony called Ohorogon, which means under the husk. And as part of that, the creation story is very long. It takes a long time to tell, but a little tiny smidge of it, the part where the food comes out of it. So a woman falls from the sky, she lands on the back of a turtle. The muskrat, as you mentioned, I think that came up in your poem, huh? The muskrat was the animal that was able to bring the sediment up, and she spread it on the back of the turtle, and she did the woman's dance, the woman's shuffle dance that people still do now. And this is how she made it big enough that everybody could be living here on the back of this turtle. She gives birth to a daughter who grows up, gets pregnant by the wind. These things don't necessarily have to make biological sense. Stay with me here. She is pregnant with twins. The good twin comes out the way that you expect babies to be born, and the other twin is impatient, comes out her side, and she dies in the process. And this is where, from her grave, is where the corn, beans, and squash come from. So the women's bodies are a very important part of these narratives around food justice and food sovereignty. So the corn comes from her breasts, and this is why corn is kind of milky when you first get it and you scrape it open. The umbilical cord, the squash, comes from her belly button, and this is why squash vines are very windy. And the beans came from her fingers, and this is why green beans look like fingers when they're growing. So again, women's bodies are a very important part of understanding what traditional foods are and why those are important to maintain. And so part of the project that I'm looking at now is looking at food sovereignty and seed sovereignty. And people have talked about the reason why heirloom seeds are so important to maintain and to bring back and to grow, and not just running off to Walmart or Home Depot and buying whatever kind of corn, beans, and squash seeds, but these seeds in particular, because when you hold one of these corn cobs in your hand, you're holding the results of the decisions of all the seed capers who came before you, all those grandmas who at that end of the season go, okay, we like them when they're this color, and we like the cobs to be this long or short, and we want the plants to be this tall or short, and we want it to grow good in this weather. All of those decisions are what lead to deciding which seed gets saved from one year to the next, and that's why these corns look the way they do now. And so that's why it's so important to revive and bring back and save these seeds. Now, in the early 20th century, there was this period of salvation ethnography. Indians were going to disappear. They're just going to die out. So all these anthropologists ran around collecting up people's stuff to put in museums to preserve this record. So we would all know what those Indians used to do back in the day now that they've all died out. And some of the things that got collected and snatched up were seeds. And they were warehoused in these little bags and on shelves. So for example, this is the Museum of Science in Minneapolis. This is the Field Museum in Chicago. And so now these seeds have been tucked away, and there's this movement, this seed rematriation movement of reuniting people with those seeds that were taken out of communities. And so thinking about this, came out a little faded looking. You probably heard the term repatriation before, or which is basically bringing home prisoners of war, things that were taken out of the community, you bring them back. So the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act has stipulated that institutions that receive federal funding have to give those things back to Native communities, ancestral remains and cultural objects. And so as part of this movement, through the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network and other organizations, we've decided to use the term rematriation instead, as an acknowledgement of the women seed keepers who often stewarded these seeds, but also because rematriation is not just this one-way arrow of sending something home, but it's a way of connecting these seeds back to the land that they came from and have been alienated from for a long time, and then also back to the indigenous people. So sort of connecting people and seeds and people and the land, bringing these things back together. And some of these seeds have been used to stop pipelines. So this is a ponca seed, and the ponca are in Oklahoma now. They were in Nebraska, minding their own business. And there are, so there's a ponca tribe in Nebraska, there's a ponca tribe in Oklahoma. Some of the ones got rounded up, and then they came back, because they're stubborn. So Amos is one of the ones who got rounded up and sent to Oklahoma. 1877, the Army comes along, says everybody, you have to go to Oklahoma. People had planted corn. They had planted their corn because they were going on about their business. And they didn't get to take seeds with them necessarily. They didn't get the chance to like properly pack for a big long trip. And so years later, this is Amos Hinton working for the agricultural program down there. And he said, we used to have all these different kinds of corn. What happened to all of these corns? And so the Pawnee Nation had one that they had gotten back through a repatriation, and so they shared some of those seeds. And then he got others through corn growers in Minnesota who had gotten some from a Dakota lady who her family had picked them at some point. And so it's this whole long convoluted story. But this corn grower in Minnesota said, well, I'm seeing some of the traits that you're looking for in this corn that I'm growing out from the Dakota. He starts selecting out those ones that look like what the Ponca tribe was looking for in this case, until they had whole ears that looked the way they wanted. And so now, every June, people gather together in this patch of land on the Tanderup farm that's in the path of the Keystone Pipeline and plant this corn as a way of saying, you shall not pass. You're not going to put your pipeline through this corn that took so long to get back, through this space that was the Ponca Trail of Tears. And this past summer, Art Tanderup deeded a patch of land here to both the Nebraska Ponca and the Oklahoma Ponca. And so now the Keystone Pipeline folks have to deal with another group of landowners if they want to put this pipeline through there. And so it's just sort of this really interesting moment where you have food standing in the path of a pipeline as well, as being another way of like, you're not going to tear this up again. In the upper corner, this is the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. So this is land that Mohawk people used to farm on before being pushed north, and now the red corn that you see in the background there is being planted. It came down to only a few cobs, and it was seed keeper Steve McCumber who planted it out till at least he had kind of a bushel, and now this past year 2,000 pounds of red corn went back to the Mohawk community, grown out on this farm hub of a bunch of white farmers. And they said, okay, this is a way of reconnecting people with that land. So this is the way that seeds, and there's also a pipeline that's supposed to go through there. So that's kind of where they initially got the idea of like, oh, hey, let's put a seed garden in the way there. So people are using seeds as a weapon against pipelines. It's sort of interesting. So ecocultural health, just to kind of wrap it all up. And this is Melissa Nelson I was talking to out of the Cultural Conservancy up in San Francisco, who really likes this term, is thinking about how the health of the land and the health of the people is inextricably linked. So when the land is not healthy, the people who are trying to live off the land are not healthy. And when the people are not healthy and they're not interacting with the land in the same way, then the land is not healthy. And so thinking about environmental reproductive justice as not just, again, can people have as many babies as they want and not be impinged by environmental contamination, but the restoration of traditional food systems and the rematriation of seeds as part of reproducing and maintaining culture. So I've probably gone on too long, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.